All right, good morning, everybody. Let me make sure. All right, I see it. Great. Hi there. My name is Samantha. I'm with Melco's application team, and today we're doing our DesignShop Talk again. We do these every Friday, or most Fridays anyway, to answer any questions you might have, whether it be about DesignShop or I'm happy to talk about anything, but predominantly about digitizing. Good morning, Mike and Margie. All right. So just as a reminder, if you see me looking over to the side, I have a second monitor with the comments going so I can keep track of anything. Be sure to type in your questions there. I don't actually have hardly any questions covered today, so be sure to add some over there so we have something to talk about. And you can also, during the week, if you think about it, you can type on the previous week's post, or you can email applications@melco.com, and we will get your questions on the list to get answered. All right. So let's start off with a few things that I did get. Good morning. So one person said, hey, they purchased a design and sewed it out, had some really strange starts and stops on the design. And how I'm reading that is, it would stop, do a trim, move, sometimes not move at all, start again and start sewing. And she says their machine didn't seem to appreciate that. How do I fix the design in DesignShop? So that's kind of a loaded question because what type of file is it? It really depends on what the design is, whether you can easily fix it or if it's a whole lot of work. So one of the first things I would do is if it's an expanded stitch type, that's when it gets complex, right? So I would open that up and look at your tree on the side. So when I say look at the tree, what I mean by that is, file, let's open up C drive, designs. I'm just going to open up an expanded file. Let's do that one. Okay, so open up a file, and over on this side, this is what I call the tree. It's a project view, technically. Good morning, Kevin. That's funny. All right, and look at how these expandeds are on the file that's giving you issues. If it's like this, where it's one element, and there's not a bunch of expandeds like in a row, then it's a little bit more difficult because you'd either have to convert it over to a wireframe and make your changes there. But remember, when you convert things to wireframe, sometimes you have to make changes to not only the one aspect you're looking at, but you also have to play with your densities and maybe the shape changed. You have more edits that you have to work on. You guys are funny. Sorry, making me laugh today. That's great. All right. So, all right, so if you have the single things like this, there's not really a lot to do. Now, if you look at your tree over here and you notice it's got a bunch of color changes, or there's a bunch of expandeds and there's trims between them, you can get rid of those trims, right? So I'm going to force this. Let me force it into multiples real quick. So if you've never done wireframe editing, it's personally not my favorite activity. But you would select your expanded, you would click on a point, and let's say we're going to insert a trim there. So now you see I have two elements. All right, and if I put the trim between there, it will actually cut, move over to the next spot. So if that's what you're seeing, that it does a stop, it does a trim, it moves hardly anything or moves a lot maybe and starts again, well, I can take this trim and just delete it. Okay, so instead of having that trim there, if I delete it, now it won't trim as long as it'll just do a jump and keep sewing. All right, so if you have multiple areas here, good morning, everybody, you can adjust it that way. So for everyone who asked, since I'm kind of rambling, let me explain what the question is. They're asking, how do I get rid of starts and stops that are strange in a file I bought? Okay, and unfortunately, it's not a straightforward, easy answer. If it's in OFM, then it becomes simple. Just look at the design, go through your elements, look at your starts and stops, and adjust them accordingly to make sure that you minimize those trims, okay, so that you don't have random stops at different places. But when you're dealing with your expanded stitch types, that's where it really becomes just an investigation game. At least that's how I look at it, of trying to figure out, can I easily deal with it? You know, can I delete a trim? Or do I really just need to redigitize that aspect of the design? Can I convert it to a wireframe and then fix it by then stepping through each element and going, all right, this starts here, stops there. You know, move your starts and stops, move your elements around. So I'm sure that's not the easy answer you wanted. And I'm sorry, when you get to that type of file, sometimes it's a conversion error. So let's say they use a different software, they do a save as, and save it in a format that you downloaded. You go to run it and it shows really strange. Try one of the other formats, right? So instead of showing an EXP or a DST, try an EXP or vice versa. So sometimes I've noticed that not certain formats, when exported from other softwares, so better. They don't have as many weird conversion type things. All right, so that would be another idea to try. All right, so I don't see any questions typed in yet, so I'll go on to... So here's another one that, again, there's unfortunately not an easy answer. Is there a way to split a DST in half so that you can use it on either sides of a seamed face mask? All right. Not easily, because if you again look at a DST is just an expanded stitch type. So if I go back to this guy here, right? So let's say this is not an example I want to put on the center of a stitch mask, but if I'm trying to cut it straight down this middle, you notice the bird, it's not going to do what I want it to do, right? Because if I cut this fill straight down here, it's going to be, you'll have that line down the middle, right? So you can't just take these elements, change them over into expanded, select them and delete stitches, because that'll leave jump stitches and other weird things. If it's an OFM, that's simple, you can break it up. But when you're dealing with your DSTs, it becomes quite complex. I know when I've done seamed type things like this, I'll actually sew the part that's going to get covered. Like I would actually sew all of this, and then on one side, and then sew this part's, you know, this one I might just delete the stitches and deal with it because it's going to get sewn up anyway. But I would have overlap planned on both sides so that when I go seam it, I don't have to worry about having loose stitches or things like that. It's not the most efficient way to sew things because you have extra stitches on each. Now, if you're dealing with OFMs, it becomes easier, right? Because you can take, let's see, let's open one. File, open a bird. All right, because you can then split your element up, right? You still have to plan it out and think about how you're going to deal with your seam allowances and things like that. But if I wanted to split the bird straight down the red line, well, I can select it. I can come over here, put a point. So I just clicked on the wireframe, added a point there, clicked on the wireframe here, added a point. Once I add it where I want to cut it, I then would hold my control key down. So I select both points. And then over here under change element type, I would come here to split the element. And now it splits it into two pieces. Okay, two separate fills that I could then take into different files. Now that is line to line, so that's another thing to consider. Do you need to, when you create your file, move that over some? And then when you create this file, move that over some so that you have some overlap. It just depends on what you want to do, of how you're going to end up seaming your mask together. Okay, so again, splitting, you would split an element like a fill or a something that has points all the way around. There was a question also, well, what would you use a break for? You can't, like if I take a fill and I try to pick a point and say split it, it's not going to do anything because it doesn't know where to split it across, right? Where do I cut from one side to the other? Whereas if I take a single line center or a line, which is just a drawn, you know, a single point that's been drawn, from there I can pick a point and say split element, which will break it into two pieces because it's only one line, so you're cutting it. Let's see, before they get lost, let me make sure I read these questions. Even with small lettering, how can I keep narrow area lines stitching tidy, such as the thin lines of a capital M? Okay, so tiny text. The other one, is there a way to select an entire design and add a bean stitch following the outer margins of the design? I want to make some felties and I don't want to click all the way around it. If it's done in OFM, yes. If it's done in DST, not really. You've got to trace around it. So that one's easy. I can show you how to do that. So, all right, real quick, let me finish my thought on breaking. So a break is taking a single line, whether it be a walk input, a single line center, something that's just one straight line of clicking. Okay, so it doesn't reconnect, and splitting that. So that's what your break is going to do. It's the same tool here. It's split element at selected point, but it basically cuts it right at that point where you click. Now when you have a fill, I can take my insert complex, draw a complex, and now if I want to cut that, split it into two elements, I have to choose the 2 points that I want to cut it across. So let's say I want to click there and here and chop the top of that off. I hold my control key to select those 2 points, say split element at selected points, and now it's split into 2 separate pieces. Okay. This is a good one to show how to make an outline as well. So my little oval, I'm going to delete that. All right, so I've got a shape, and let's say I want to add an outline to it, but I don't want it directly on the shape. I want it offset a little bit like you would do. Well, it depends on how you want to do it. So if I want it directly on the shape, there's a few tricks you can use. There's a control key or shift key. Shift adds, control replaces. So if I hold my shift key down, and because I want to add an outline, I don't want to get rid of the shape, I just want to add an outline. So if I select the shape first, hold shift, and then click on, let's say, select walk input method. What that did is, you look down here, that added a walk normal around the shape. Okay, so I can hide that so you can see it. There's my walk normal. All right. Now, what if I didn't want that the exact same, right on the border? I want it offset a little bit. Okay, well, if I take my fill, and I'm just going to copy and paste it. So copy, paste. Now I have 2 fills. Do I need 2 fills? No. But what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to go to Object, Offset Outline, all right, while selecting on it. Or you can select it and then go right-click, Operations, Offset Outline. It takes you to the same thing. And then offset it. I'm going to make it where we can easily see it. So I'm going to do a 20-point offset. So now I've got a small fill and a larger fill. I don't need that larger fill. I just want that to be my walk input. So this is where I'm going to use the control key because I want to replace that fill with my walk. So instead of shift, which adds, I'm going to hold control and click on the walk input. And now that big fill is gone and I have that. Okay, so if any shape that you have, if you have it in any format, whether it be a fill or a vector, it doesn't matter. You can use the control, click on it, whatever type of element. Me pointing at my screen is not doing any good, huh? All right, control and click on what you want it to be, and that will replace whatever you selected with it. Shift, click on what you want it to be, will add. All right, hope that makes sense. So with small lettering, how can I keep narrow areas stitching tidy? The smaller you get, the more complex it kind of gets. I don't know, complex is probably not the right term, but really thin areas, you want to make sure you have a nice underlay that you can with like a center walk, because you can't fit zigzags and other things under really narrow areas. So having a nice center walk, keeping the stitch length relatively small so that you have a nice line of thread there helps. Making sure you have a decent amount of pull compensation, or basically think about making it thicker than it looks on the screen, because when it actually sews out, it's going to shrink some just with push and pull. So by adding that extra pull onto it to make it a little bit wider, when it sews out, it's going to shrink up a little bit, and it'll keep it nice and compact for you. Other tricks to use making small lettering look clean and neat is to make sure you're using smaller needles. That makes a big difference, and thinner thread. Okay, for how much pull comp, I usually add a point to 2 points. When I look at it on the screen, I always try to make it look almost too bold on the screen, not enough to where you can't read it, right? But just a little bit more bold on the screen than you would want it to actually sew out, and that tends to work pretty well for me personally. I know that's a little subjective, but 1 to 2 points. I don't use pull comp by percent, particularly because a percent of a small number is still a small number, so it's not really doing a whole lot for you. But keep in mind, pull offset, that pull comp by offset, that's 1 point on each side. The more you do that, the wider it's going to be and the more bulky and hard to see it's going to end up. So you don't want to do, if you're finding yourself adding 2, 3, 4 points, it's going to start, not looking clean. So sticking to 1 point, 2 points max. My personal limit is no more than 3. Once I get to 3, it's starting to look silly. So it's better to do something else. Okay. What other questions? Is there anything good written on pull comp and offset? There's a few different documents out on, let's see if I can find them. I know we've got several videos that have been done on that. Maybe one of the guys will find them, but melcoservice.com. See if I get lucky. If I go to the FAQ, pull comp. Let's see if this takes me to the video or to the document I'm thinking of. Let's see, what's this? This is not what I was thinking, but this is good. This is good info. So this just shows you how to do it, but not what about it. So there are a few videos that Scott did, I think, and I know Nate has some as well, but that were done on small lettering in particular, where he shows all of those. I know in the For the Love of Melco group, I wrote quite a long time ago a pretty long document on pull compensation in general. So there is a document out there which shows the difference between using pull by percent or by using pull comp by number. Hey, Juliet. So you can check those out as well. We'll try. I think we need to get the links up here, and I'll try to get those links out for you too, so that you can review those later. Okay. What other questions do we have? Because as you can see from the ones that were sent in, that's all I have. All right, Lori. If you have not watched it, there's a really good video on small lettering that was done last year. It's what, 45 minutes or so, 50 minutes. I don't know. It's just done really well. So check that out. Would sewing machine help as well with the small lettering? Yeah, in general, you don't need to sew tiny lettering. I don't know, this is at least how I think about it. I'm not sure it's the right way to think about it. It's how I think about it anyway. When you're dealing with small needles and small thread, right? So the smaller the needle is, the diameter gets it keeps getting tinier and tinier. All right. So think about if I'm trying to sew with a nail versus a wire. A thin wire. What's going to happen to it? My nail is going to hold very still. It's not going to flex at all. When you go to that wire, now it's going to be more prone to moving around. All right, so it's going to be more prone to flexing. Well, the faster I go, the more that thread running through the needle is going to pull. Right, so if it's pulling on something, if it's really thin, it's going to move. Right, so the thinner the needle gets, the more relevant. I always think about it as paying attention to my tension to make sure it's not too tight, because when it pulls, that's going to be more likely to pull the needle. Well, if my needle's bent and I go to sew, what's going to happen? It's going to break, right? So yes, slowing down, that was a long way to say slowing down the machine can help with when you're doing small things. Okay, that's just, I always try to think about it in practical terms. It makes more sense to me. All right, what other questions do we have now that I wave my finger around? Hey, look at that, my finger bends weird. Anyway, what other questions can I help with? Looks like Nate or Scott put up a bunch of links for you, Lori, so hopefully those help out. Anything else? I'll wait a few seconds and look a little foolish, see if anyone has any questions before I just call it a day. Oh, that's true. I forgot about that. And that's a really important one. When you start going into textured fabrics or really small, you want, basically think about it, you're trying to prevent the thread from sinking into the fabric. So putting a topper on top of there helps a lot, right? Making sure you have underlay, because now I've put a piece of thread on top of my fabric, so when it goes to sew, it can't sew in because it's going to sit on top of that thread. Well, in the same vein, if you put a topper on there, it's just something else to help keep the thread out of the material. All right, cool. Any other questions? Anyone got any good plans for the weekend? I'm running. That's about it. All right. Well, I hope everyone's... Oh, on the outline, if the design is made of multiple parts, do you have to do the full outline to get... do you have to do the full outline to get a walk stitch border? Yes. Let me go show that in a second. Let me read the other question so it doesn't lose. What do you think about embroidery on masks? I've had people asking me about it, and I'm mixed on it. So that's a tricky topic, mainly because masks, just technically speaking, are an FDA product. They're a medical product. So if you are making masks for medical purposes, they have to be licensed and tested and all that fun stuff. So I've never done any of that testing, so I don't know what to say personally. If you're doing fashion masks, and what I mean by fashion masks, they're not medical devices. They're not intended to replace protective gear, personal protective gear, like your N95 masks, surgical masks, things like that. Then, I don't know, adding embroidery to it, it's just for fashion purposes, so it shouldn't matter at all. So there's that. I mean, depending on how you're making them from a practical perspective, I've seen different people doing tests online just to try to gauge for themselves how effective their item is. It's all non-scientific type stuff, so probably not the wisest thing to follow. But, simple things of, how many particles, droplets are getting through there, and they'll spray it with hold the fabric up. So if you embroider it, hold it up in front of a mirror and spray the fabric and see how much gets through it to give you a kind of idea of what it's doing. I don't know. Without actually going through and doing formal testing, I wouldn't be comfortable claiming any amount of effectiveness of any of the masks. But the CDC even says something is better than nothing. So along those fronts, something's better than nothing. So even if it has sewing on it. Okay. Yeah, someone else just posted, if you're going to embroider it, just do the outer layer and have your inner layers solid. So there's that. The question, if stitching on slick scrub tops, small letterings, wet backings, things that are slick, depends if it's really slick is not really what I would worry about, more so as the weight of the fabric. So I like sewing on cutaways, period. I'm not a big fan of tearaways. So there's that. So when you use if you look at the weight of the fabric, let's say it's a really thin material, you don't want to use a super heavy backing because you're going to be more likely to see that badge effect hanging up there. So maybe using one of the no-show meshes or the performance backings would be a good idea on there. Making sure it's nice and stabilized. You can use, especially if it's slick or stretchy, using some 505 to hold it to the stabilizer is always a good idea. It doesn't have to be 505. That's just, everyone seems to remember that one. K100, you know, any of the spray adhesives. That's really the thing, is spray adhesive. The outline question, that one left my list and I didn't want to miss it. And there was also another one, is a certain size to use in making a decorative stitch. All right, so when you have, let's go to the, yeah, if it's thin with a bit of stretch, finishing up the scrub, I would probably use, personally, I would use a layer of the the no-show mesh and a layer of 3.1, and then I'd use a 505 adhesive between everything to make it all stay put. Yeah, the performance backing that Madeira has, I've tried that recently. It's nice stuff. So you can use that too. But basically, I would think light and very stable to hold it still. And then just do a good job of hooping it, and it never hurts to stick all the layers together to add that additional stability to it. So let's see. Let me go open something that has a bunch of shapes to it. I don't know. We should just pick something instead of scrolling around. Where's the boat? I want the balloons. Balloon? See if that's the one I wanted. Nope, that's not what I wanted, but oh well, it'll do. Let's see. So when you if you're trying to do an outline around multiple shapes, and this is not a good one for me to show you. Let's just do the boats. All right. So you can't just select and tell it to make an outline unless you have a single shape, right? So you can come over and create a vector, which is usually what I end up doing just because it's quick, or it's quick for me anyway. I'll trace around. Depending on what I'm trying to do, you can zoom in closer, of course, and get more accurate than the mess I'm making right now. But you get the general idea, right? So you would trace around whatever you want. You can either use your complex fill, a vector. I usually just use the vector to keep it simple because I don't need the threads. I don't need the extra stuff if all I'm going to do is take that shape and now do something with it, right? So if I take this, I can then either go ahead, select it, hold my shift key to add, control key to replace. This is a vector, so it doesn't really matter. So I can just hold my shift and say, let's add a border. So now I have a single line center added all the way around. And I can turn that off so you can see it. So if I were going to make my own patch out of this, that might be one way. Well, let's say I don't really want that right on top of the edge. Okay, well, in that case, I would take my vector, and I would go into that same offset outline, which is a level dependent feature, and do however much you want. I'll make it a large offset so you guys can see it easily. And then I would get rid of that because we don't need that if it's going to be outside the shape anyway. Okay, so from here again, I can hold my shift key, click on the single line center, and now I have a border around there. Okay, you can then work. I did see a question posted in a group somewhere that says, hey, on my applique pieces, how can I increase the size of the border so that I don't see the fabric sticking through so much? That if it's done in OFM, it's easy. You would just come in here and change the width. If it's a expanded file, you can try doing tricks with this is not the expanded one, is it? Nope. But you could come in here to the scale and try playing with your pole compensation. I would do it by offset for the particular element and see if that helps. Otherwise, it's just I find it easier personally, but I also digitize to just do my own border. So click through it and then change the width of that border, that single line center. I like using 45 right around there for most appliques. I know that's a very personal preference. Some people are happy with it being closer to 35 to 40. Others like it closer to 45 to 50. I've even seen people using 55, which is pretty large. It's completely a personal preference of what do you like? How thick do you like those borders to be? How thick do you need them to cover up the fabric? Okay. Any other questions? I don't remember if I missed any, and I only, like I said, I only see 4 comments on the screen, so I apologize if I forgot one, because the last 4 comments aren't questions. Okay. I wonder if I click see all. Nope. Okay. Well, I hope this was helpful. I don't see any other questions typed in. All right. Well, I guess everyone enjoy your time. I hope this was helpful for you. Remember to send in your questions. You can send them to applications@melco.com. You can type them in. Usually around Wednesday evening, Thursday morning, the post for the live event pops up. Type them in on the post. All right, and I'll get them added. And I like the questions ahead of time. That way I have something to talk to rather than myself for a while. So, let's see. The one I missed was, oh, the size of making a decorative stitch. Thank you. All right. So that one, it's what are you trying to do with the decorative? What I kind of want to say no, there's no particular size because you can do decoratives as big or as small as you want. And what do I mean by that? I'll show you an example. Let's see if, yeah, it's on this. This is one I did a long time ago. And it's huge because it was intended, you can see this is close to 7 inches tall. I was doing this as a quilt pattern on a quilted bag I was doing. Okay, so I created the decorative of one thing and its application was large. So I made a very large decorative stitch. It starts there, it ends right there, and it repeats itself, right? So I could do that quilting panel or very easily. But if I were then going to do a decorative similar to, let's say, this, okay, so this one, its application is much smaller, right? I'm trying to imitate a chain stitch. So when doing that, you really have to pay attention to the size of the stitch that you're trying to imitate, and you would want to specifically digitize it so that it's small enough for there. I would say if you're going to go into small type detail work, you know, keep in mind how large a needle is. Your regular 7511 needle is what, 7 points about, roughly. That's probably not the most accurate number, but roughly about 7 points. So when you're going stitch to stitch, you generally don't want to go 1 point apart, right? So 1 stitch and a stitch 1 point over, because if you're using a 7511 needle, that's really asking for trouble, right? That's where you're going to have super short stitches. It's going to be more prone to thread errors and things like that. So pay attention. You can always, as you're digitizing those small type details, you can use the manual input method. And if you look down at the bottom here, this X and Y, that helps you get reference on how far you're moving things. So you can see right now the L is 11, A is 72, I'm at 72 degrees, and my length is 11 points right now. So you can kind of watch down there to make sure you're not getting your points or, you know, your stitches super short, right? Which is just going to cause you problems. So trying to be cognizant that your stitch lengths are long enough to be able to cleanly stitch is probably the only thing as to getting too small, and you can make them as big as you want. All right. What other questions? Any? All right. Thank you for pointing out the one I missed because I can't see them once they go. I should probably get a paper so I can scratch them down, but then you guys would have to watch me write. All right. Okay, everyone. Well, I hope this was helpful. Hope you learned something or picked up a trick or something. And send in your questions, type them in on Wednesday or Thursday, and we'll get them added to our list and see what we can do to get them answered. All right. Appreciate you guys joining me, and I will talk to you guys next week. All right. Have a great week.